Hello, and welcome back to our series of studies on the great 19th century philosopher Soren Kierkegaard. This is the 13th in a series of studies. We'll probably end up with 30 studies by the time we're done. Each of the studies lasts 30 minutes because that's pretty much the limit of my bandwidth in uploading to YouTube. They're all going to be on YouTube, and you can access those by going to my Facebook page and just putting a search. Just go to www.facebook.com and do a search for my name, Ross M. Baughn. That's Ross M. Baghne. It's based on my book I wrote and was published a few years ago. And now we're continuing our study, which started at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Cheyenne, Wyoming, back in October of 2010. Now we're continuing because a lot of people, or some people, not a lot, recommended that a deeper explanation needs to be given. And it's not easy to do justice to a great thinker like Soren Kierkegaard. So I thought we would expand on all these studies and go through the book in further depth. We're now in chapter 5, and we're talking about, in the philosophical fragments, the self-irony of reason and the absolute paradox, and how reason, in coming into contact with the absolute paradox, which Johannes Climacus in this case defines as the God, which is a perfectly acceptable and understandable definition for God, or for absolute truth. Ultimate truth is the highest reality we can know. And if God does exist, then God would be the highest reality that we can come into contact with, and thus the ultimate truth. So we ended up, I believe, on page 130. We ended, I think, right at the end of 130 in our last lesson. So reason has this natural motivation to come into conflict with a thought it cannot think. And it seeks its own downfall. And this is the nature of all passions in general, is to seek their own downfall. And reason in philosophy does the same thing. So when the reason tries to come into contact with the absolute paradox, the God, the highest thing that can be thought, it keeps coming into this paradox that it cannot think what is absolutely unlike itself. But in this attempt, the reason constantly creates the absolute paradox, the God, in terms of its own creation, because man cannot conceive of the God entirely outside of who he himself is, and so always reconstructs the God in his own likeness. In other words, reason alone creates a God in its own likeness. And Walter Lowry, as I've mentioned before, says this whole analysis can be the basis of a whole school of thought in comparative religion, as to how different cultures recreate a God in their own image, in their own likeness. It would be an interesting study to do, to go through history and go through all the different gods in the world and how they were created in their own culture using their own concepts, like whether it's Greek mythology, whether it's Hindu mythology, whether it's Norwegian mythology. Throughout the ages, you have all sorts of concepts of what the god or the gods are like, and how man constantly creates them, but using their own values and their own cultures and their own way of looking at things. So the reason constantly comes into conflict with the absolute unknown, the God, ultimate truth. The unlikeness clings to the reason and confounds it, so that the reason no longer knows itself and quite consistently confuses itself with the unlikeness. On this point, paganism has been sufficiently prolific. As for the last named supposition, the self-irony of the reason, I shall attempt to delineate it merely by a stroke or two, without raising any question as to whether it's historical. And here he gets in indirectly to an analysis of how Christianity itself comes into the formation of a concept of God, and why it's different from any other religion in the entire world. The God is the completely unknown, and the difference between man and the God is infinite. Unless reason were to be able to understand the God and himself at the same time, it cannot understand the paradox. If the God is absolutely unlike man, then man is absolutely unlike the God. But how could reason be expected to understand this? Here we seem to be confronted with a paradox. Merely to obtain the knowledge that the God is unlike him, man needs the help of the God, and now he learns that the God is absolutely different from himself. But if the God and the man are absolutely different, this cannot be accounted for on the basis of what man derives from the God. For insofar they are akin, their likeness must therefore be explained by what man derives from himself, or by what he has brought upon his own head. But what can this unlikeness be? Aye, what can it be but sin? Since the unlikeness, the absolute unlikeness, is something that man has brought upon himself, we have experienced this we have expressed this in the preceding by saying that man was in error and had brought this upon his head by his own guilt. And we came to the conclusion, partly in jest and yet also in earnest, that it was too much to expect of man that he should find out this for himself. So it is the God, as we talked about in a prior portion of the fragments, that needs to reveal this to man in order to reconcile man to the God. So I like to try to, throughout the book, summarize SK's positions in maybe a little more understandable terms. And here's one of my explanations here on page 133. And hopefully you've bought the book now. It's on Amazon.com. Just go to Amazon and put in my name, Ross M. Bond, and you can buy a book and follow along, because that's really would be the best way to do it. To put this statement a different way, the learner is faced with a paradox in trying to understand the unknown, and a paradox is the passion for all thinking. He repeatedly comes into contact with the paradox and is unable to think it, that is, to resolve the difference between what is totally unthinkable and unknown to himself. But then, when the God himself decides to overcome the paradox by becoming completely like the learner, the paradox is made all the more absurd by overcoming an infinite unlikeness with a complete likeness by the God becoming a man. And that's what we went into in more depth in our last lesson. That God overcomes the absolute paradox by becoming absolutely like a man, in fact, the lowliest man on earth. And this would never occur to any other religion. In fact, it's Christianity that it has the humiliation of God on the cross as its highest accomplishment, its highest point on earth, in the God being crucified. And this is something Bruce Shelley points out. There's no other religion that has ever conceptualized anything coming close to this, that in the humiliation of its God, it conquers. Every other religion sees the conquering God as a worldly, successful God. The Jews thought the same thing, and the Greeks thought the same things about their gods, about how they conquer, how they're about their successes and so forth in a hero worship, so to speak. So this is what makes the absolute paradox in Christianity absolutely paradoxical. which no thought can overcome. And after this, SK follows with an analysis of offended consciousness. When this truth is taught to people, they have different responses. If they're offended, then they are either offended passively or they are offended passionately. What follows is an analysis of the offended consciousness. If reason and absolute paradox come together in a mutual understanding, then it will be a happy union. If not, the understanding, and then the understanding does not come about, then the relationship will be unhappy and may be characterized as offense. Whether the offended individual sits broken-hearted, staring almost like a beggar at the paradox, paralyzed by his suffering, or he sheathes himself in the armor of derision, pointing the arrows of his wit as if from a distance, he is still passive and near at hand. Whether offense came and robbed the offended individual of his last bit of comfort and joy, or made him strong, the offended consciousness is there, that nevertheless passive. It has wrestled from the stronger, and it has wrestled with the stronger, and its shows of strength, and its show of strength is like the peculiar agility induced in the bodily sphere by a broken back. And this was an allusion to, well, I don't mean to laugh, because this was the ailment that SK suffered from himself. It was caused by falling from a tree when he was a child. And he probably broke his spine, and it never healed correctly. And that's why when in 1855, when he came to his deathbed, he was walking home from a bank, and finally the broken back ruptured his back and spinal cord, and it paralyzed him from the waist down, and then that's how he died later in, I believe it was November of 1855. But it is a reference to how even in a active rebellion toward this revelation of the God, the individual fights uselessly against the higher truth of what ultimately SK exposes to be, of course, Christianity. So the fruitless, the hopeless battle of a man with a broken back against a higher force. So that's how I interpret that allusion. And this offense is an indirect proof for the truth of the paradox, as Kierkegaard often points out. Here in particular, one is not offended by what is false, but only by what is true. It is just a part of our human nature. But it is especially true in the case of the paradox, which is ultimate truth. And the idea of offense is continually repeated in Kierkegaard's works, especially in books like Training in Christianity, which is one of his religious works. So I do get into my own sort of commentary on this, and you might be surprised that I make so bold as to make some observations about this. And one observation I had is where I disagree here with Johannes Climacus is that if there's an infinite difference between man and the God, then that would amount to no interest, because an infinite difference shares no basis for interest whatsoever. So I would define that rather in this way, is that it is an estrangement of an indeterminate nature that only the God really understands, and really that the God is capable of overcoming. Because God in his infinite wisdom gives man the natural ability to still preserve ethical truth, and you see that in Greek philosophy. I've been reading about Aristotle lately and how, and other Greek philosophers, how through natural reason, and especially Socrates, how through natural reason man can understand a lot of the God, a lot about what is ethics and what is not ethics. So this understanding in the conscience is not completely overcome, or is not completely different from the God, because then there is no connection. So that's one observation I have. What Johannes Climacus would think, I don't know, but I can't see an infinite difference between man and God as resulting in any sort of connection. They're just totally without any relationship whatsoever. The reason that in pagan religions one is constantly seeking the God is because there is this estrangement. Otherwise, as I say, man and God would have nothing in common at all. And man was made in the image of God according to Genesis. So there is that aspect of God still in man. So the God did not assume the form of a servant to make a mockery of men. Hence, it cannot be his intention to pass through the world in such manner that no single human being becomes aware of his presence. He will doubtless, therefore, give up some sort of a sign, though every understanding resting upon it as an accommodation is essentially without value for one who does not receive the condition, as we were talking before, that the God in this thought experiment, because you have to remember this is a thought experiment. Because Kierkegaard understood very well, in this case, in the words of Johannes Climacus, that one cannot prove Christianity, but one can only quicken one's mind with respect to the divine. And each person has to make that leap of faith himself to decide whether he wants to believe it or he doesn't want to believe it. There is no rational reason to prove what the truth of Christianity is. It is accomplished by a leap. Now, in this scenario, the God's appearance has now become the news of the day, in the marketplace, in the homes of the people, in the council chamber, in their ruler's palace. It gives occasion for much foolish and idle talk, perhaps also some earnest reflection. But for the learner, the news of the day is not an occasion for something else, not even an occasion for the acquirement in Socratic sincerity of a deeper and fuller self-knowledge for the learner. It is the eternal, the beginning of eternity. The news of the day is the beginning of eternity. And of course, this is the gospel, the revelation of Jesus Christ as the ultimate truth. So we see that now the scene is set for the learner to come into a relationship with the paradox. How does the learner come to realize in understanding with this paradox? It comes to pass when reason and the paradox encounter one another happily in the moment, which we were talking about earlier in the fragments. The moment is that moment in time where man comes into contact with the eternal, with the absolute truth. And SK calls it the moment. When the reason sets itself aside and the paradox bestows itself through the leap of faith. When the reason sets itself aside in favor of faith in order to reconcile itself with the teacher, it is easy to see that faith does not depend upon reason, but upon faith. Also, faith is not a human act of will, for all human volition has its capacity within the scope of an underlying condition. And what that means is in this case, the learner is absolutely dependent upon the God, the absolute paradox, to bestow the condition upon the learner, which is another way, a philosophical way, whatever you want to call it, of speaking about the born again experience. Therefore, if the new condition is not given, then the learner must revert to the original Socratic understanding that the condition was within the learner all the time. Now, we have about 10 minutes. Now, a question arises, is the contemporary learner at any greater advantage than the subsequent learner? Is not contemporaneity to the paradox a tremendous advantage? No, the reason is simple. With respect to an absolute paradox, the occasion by which one comes into contact with the moment and the teacher is no greater for the contemporary than it was for the subsequent learner, because the difference is absolutely infinite, and the condition in both cases must be given by the teacher, or else we return to the Socratic recollection of the God, which is Socratic recollection of God, in which God is ubiqua et nusquam, everywhere and nowhere. So now we get on to page 138, and we're not going to have time to get through this whole part here because we're down to about 8 minutes, and but let's get into it. It's called the interlude. Now, in this question as to whether the contemporary has an advantage, like let's say St. Peter, Mary, Mother of God, Mary Magdalene, any of the apostles, disciples, etc., do they have any greater closeness, or are they favored more than the later disciples, such as ourselves, or in SK's generation in the 19th century? Or are they the same? Is there an advantage, in other words, to being contemporary with Christ? And this is something that Lessing maintained. He's maintained that there was definitely a greater advantage to those who were contemporary. So he takes this as an occasion to analyze this problem in the interlude, which is a major problem. It's a major question, because if people who were contemporary to Christ had an advantage, then they had an enormously greater advantage than the latter disciples. And he takes this as an occasion to analyze in history the concept of necessity, because he's analyzing the time period that took place between the life of Christ and what we experienced today in the Bible and in the teaching of the Word in the church, as to whether or not there's this greater advantage. And therefore he's analyzing these centuries that intercede, and takes us as an occasion to analyze necessity in history. And of course, this was an extremely important question during the 19th century in light of Hegel's philosophy of history, and then later Marx's philosophy of history, which he called dialectical materialism. And so, which were both based on this idea that there is a necessity in history, and both Hegel and Marx thought they had come to understand this necessity in history. When we look at history and we think we have understood it, is this understanding that we have any better than our understanding of the future? In other words, is the past more necessary than the future? Or to put it another way, when the possible becomes actual, is it thereby made more necessary than it was? Climacus's analysis is very reminiscent of the scholastic theologians of the Middle Ages, and I'm going to get into my own commentary on this and how Luther dealt with the same problem. of necessity in history. Climacus' point of view is that whatever comes into existence shows that by coming into existence that it is not necessary. That is, that whatever comes into being comes in via freedom, and not by a logical construction such as the Hegelian system and Marx's dialectical materialism. It should first be mentioned here that existence in this case is to be understood in the widest possible sense. It involves everything in the natural order, in nature, for example, and to the specifically historical coming into existence, such as a plan in the mind of Napoleon, for example, because in history there's a second coming into existence which does not apply to nature. In nature there's only one coming into existence. In this analysis, first of all, Johannes Climacus analyzes the specific change in being which the coming into existence entails. It is unique in the fact that all other changes in being presuppose something that changes, but the coming into existence type of change is a change from non-being to being, that is, from possibility to actuality. And here he's going back to Hegel, and Hegel went back to Aristotle and this idea of potentiality and actuality, possibility and actuality. But precisely, the change is proof that it is not necessary, because that which is necessary does not and cannot change, because it is just that, necessary. If it changed, then it would prove itself to not be necessary. All coming into existence takes place with freedom, not by necessity. Nothing comes into existence by virtue of a logical ground, but only by a cause. Every cause terminates in a freely affecting cause. Even the possibility of deducing consequences from a law of nature gives no evidence of the necessity of any coming into existence, which is clear as soon as one reflects definitely upon coming into existence. Now, I put my own little side note in here. This is a very extremely interesting observation, because even physics and modern physics, quantum mechanics, has come to realize that natural laws are not dependable 100% of the time. They're not perfectly and completely and totally dependable. You could have one law of nature that works for millions of years, and then suddenly it does not work the same way the next time. So physics is recognized that these laws that we depend on, and we depend on every day of our lives, are not completely and 100% totally necessary. And why is that? Well, that's because God is not subject to natural laws. He can change them anytime he wants. So they will never be completely dependable. And further, in physics, for example, there will never be a so-called theory of everything. Einstein was wrong when he said that God does not play dice with the universe. God does play dice with the universe, only they are loaded dice. Events in nature usually happen the way we think, but not always. Now, in the class I was teaching at St. Paul's, I asked the class, can you think of examples in nature in the Bible, in the history of the Bible, which shows the same thing, that God changes natural laws? And the ones we came up with were Joshua and how he made the sun stand still, the star over Bethlehem, which led the wise men to the dwelling place of Christ in Bethlehem. And there are other such examples in where Christ himself turns loaves of bread, a few loaves into thousands of loaves, and a few fish into thousands of fish. So God can and does change natural laws anytime he wants. Well, I think this is a really excellent place to leave off here on page 139. And I'm going to upload this to YouTube a little later on tonight, so hopefully it'll be available tomorrow. It takes 5-6 hours to upload, unfortunately. But it should be online, and you can get a link on my Facebook page. And we'll go on through the fragments, and then we'll get to the postscript. And we're really now in the heart and soul of Kierkegaard's epistemology on the relationship between reason and faith. And I hope everybody joins us again, hopefully tomorrow, in study number 14. Goodbye.